The saga of the American West is one of the most enduring and fascinating in our history. Beginning next week on PBS, an 8-part documentary attempts to demystify the stories and events that shaped our nation. From the people responsible for the Civil War and baseball, it is called simply The West. Joining me now, Ken Burns, the series executive producer and creative consultant, a man whom I called the Godfather. In fact, I said to him he was always a godfather, never a god. Stephen Ives, the director and co-producer, and Jeffrey Ward, the co-writer of the script and the author of the companion book of the same title, The West. Welcome. I'm delighted to have you here on the show.
It's great to see you.
Well, I'd like to start with one little fact that I actually found sort of quite fascinating, and that is, how did we come to call it The West?
Well, it's the best question. We call it the West because the last people to arrive there conquered it, claimed it, and named it. But it's the North to Hispanics that moved up. It's the East to the Chinese and the Russians who came in. It's the South for the British and French explorers. And for us, most important, it was home for the center of the universe, for hundreds of not monolithically same, simplistic, noble Indians, but an incredibly diverse set of tribes and human beings subject to the same problems and ills that the rest of us have.
Well, you know, Ken, you've done several amazing films, baseball and the Civil War, each of which I might say I gather took 5 years, so I'm glad you're into deferred pleasure. But you keep on saying that your films are really intended to sort of illustrate what it means to be an American. Give us some of your take on how this film tells you what it means to be an American.
Well, I think I woke up in this project realizing that each of the projects that we've involved ourselves in ask a simple basic question: who are we? Shelby Foote said in the Civil War that the Civil War defined us. It was the traumatic event in the childhood of our nation. If that's true, and I think it is, then the West is where we, for good or ill, came of age. This is where the best of us met the worst of us, and nothing was left unchanged. We fulfilled the destiny of our nation to be a continental nation, and the story of that, it combines a mixture of pride and shame. And I think what we've tried to do over the last few years is put our arm around that pride and shame and experience both.
Well, you talk about sort of the competing myths that, in a sense, are captured in your filming of all of this. Give us some sense of what those competing myths are, Steve.
Well, I think in many ways they're all part of one incredibly powerful myth, this idea that the West is this repository of hope that has drawn thousands and thousands of generations of people to the West. I think what fascinates me about it is that this nation really discovered itself when it went west. And to become a continental nation took tremendous effort, and there are amazing achievements that you can point to, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, for example. But there was also a tragic cost that I think was left in the wake of something like Manifest Destiny. And so I think this myth has grown up to help us as a nation reconcile and deal with that kind of history. And I think it is the most, in many ways, the most powerful way that we define ourselves today. We dress in Western clothes, we sell every product you can think of in Monument Valley, we export the image of the Marlboro Man abroad. Our politicians wrap themselves in the mantle of the cowboy. And I think that if that myth is going to be such a powerful way for us to see ourselves, a kind of a collective identity for this country, then I think it's important that we take a very clear-eyed look at what that myth is based on.
Well, you point out that the myth in one part was popularized by Wild Bill, that he sort of came and it was sort of a great big circus, I suppose, that he went around performing and presenting the development of the West as really the conquest of these horrible savages. But there is, without diminishing, in fact, the enormous effort and achievement that went into developing the West, there was also another side to it. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's actually, we follow Buffalo Bill Cody. And his story is an incredible case of the myth and the reality of the West being a very blurred line indeed. I mean, he lived many of the things that he then acted out for millions of people in places like Staten Island and in Europe. And I think that what's fascinating about his life is that he seems to embody this complicated story of kind of an inverted conquest, Richard White, one of our historians, remarks on it that in the Wild West show, all you see is Indians attacking whites. You see them raiding the Deadwood stage and being saved by Buffalo Bill, attacking a settler's cabin and being saved. And it's this odd story where the conquerors become the victims, as if we didn't plan it, they attacked us, and in the end, we ended up with the whole continent, which is an odd way to look back on a process of nation building, which truly was a process that left a tremendous amount of death and destruction in its wake.
Well, somebody once said that the essence of human beings is not in their ability to reason, but in their ability to rationalize.
Right.
And I think inevitably everybody sort of paints their own history in a way that serves their particular interest for, as we say, for those who were the victors.
Exactly.
Well, and that's exactly what happened, and now you're giving the other side the price that was paid, because clearly there were enormous achievements as we went. You talk about sort of the myth of optimism and the sense of hope that, in a sense, was personified in the West, and that whole theory of the history of our country, the frontier and everything like that. But in a sense, immigrants coming to this country also had that sense of hope about America. So this was an extension of that.
Sure, I think you can say that in many ways the West began 200 yards west of the stockade at Jamestown. Right. I mean, this is a story that is as old as America's movement across the continent. And I think that in many ways that's one of the reasons why certainly the drama and the way that we perceive the West happened in John Ford's West as much as anywhere else, west of the Mississippi. But the stories are as old as this republic.
Well, the notion of go west, young man, was really that a statement of go out there and you can remake your life, you can rebuild your life, you can find a family, find a new career, give up whatever problems or difficulties you had, and that was, in a sense, a symbol of that sense of hope and opportunity.
And I want to stress that while we've certainly, most of the series really tries to take into account the tragic cost of the geography of hope, which is what you've described, that Wallace Stegner called it. The series is, in a way, what Jeff and the other writer, Dayton Duncan, have found are the stories that are the backbone of this series, are stories of essentially Americans struggling along the Oregon Trail, going to the gold fields and coming up empty, trying to convert savages to God, trying to find God for themselves if they're a Mormon in the deserts of Utah, trying to carve out a life in the plains, the arid plains of Nebraska. And that really the heroes of the story emerge, not just the Chief Josephs and the Sitting Bulls, but the Mattie Oblingers, the Catherine Sagers, the William Swains, the names that have not been household names, but are the real heroes that I hope will diminish the Jesse Jameses and the Wild Bill Hickoks and the need to romanticize. It was safer to be in Dodge City, Kansas than in the Lower East Side, back then as well as now.
Well, a lot of Hollywood people would disagree with you, but let's, if I may, take two things. We have two clips here. One is called The West Vanquished Tribes, and the other is The West Letter to Mother, and I think they'll give two sides of this thing. So let's show them, and then we'll pick up again.
Most of our few warriors left from the Big Hole had been swept as leaves before the storm. A young warrior, wounded, lay on a buffalo robe dying without complaint. Children crying with cold, no fire, there could be no light. Everywhere the crying, the death wail. I felt the coming end, all for which we had suffered, lost. Thoughts came of the Wallowa, where I grew up, of my own country when only Indians were there, of teepees along the bending river, of the blue, clear lake, wide meadows with horse and cattle herds. From the mountain forest, voices seemed calling. I felt as dreaming, not my living self.
Jeff, we saw a scene of the horse, and of course the horse was introduced to this country. But there was another horse too, the Iron Horse, the railroad that transversed this country and really, in a sense, integrated the whole continent. Talk to me about the impact of those two sort of means of transportation and what they meant for the whole development of the West.
Well, the railroad story is a wonderful story. It links the coasts. It really makes us a continental nation, its most American story, it was billed by Chinese and Irishmen. And that, I think that's the kind of mixture that we hope to convey throughout this whole series. It's a very complicated, very rich, and in the best sense American, that is mixed story.
Now, it's interesting that we were able to undertake this. What was sort of the period of time during which it took, in a sense, to build this sort of transcontinental railroad? We're talking about less than 10 years for at least the initial link, are we not?
Yes, we are. Yeah, much less.
And
yes.
what kind of sort of traffic did it begin to develop as soon as it was complete? What kind of sort of movement of people did this remarkable means of transportation bring about?
Well, it did all sorts of things. It created the cattle business, the cowboy, very brief cowboy story that we think of as the whole West, unless you look at it carefully, because you could get cattle to the eastern cities. It allowed for the real peopling of California because it could bring people very cheaply out, and the railroads began to compete immediately to see how, I think it's, what is it?
From Omaha to California to LA for $1
Yeah.
during a fair war
Yeah.
in the 1880s.
That was all done by boosters and promoters in California to get you out there.
Get people out
We
there.
ended up with LA as the result.
Yep.
Still for $1?
You want to go there for $1? That's another question.
Now, a lot of people went out to that part of the world when the gold rush sort of became an absolute phenomenon. You had, what, 50,000 people going out in the first year after that? Tell us a little bit about that.
Huge traffic jam along the road to California. I mean, people went overland, like our boy William Swain, who we follow. They went around Cape Horn if they wanted to gamble that way and had to navigate the jungles over the Isthmus of Panama. And it was really an incredible human stampede that changed the West, not only for California, but California became the source of capital that then fueled investment in the West, and people began to fill in the interior of the continent, not by going west, but by going east, back from California.
Let me just go to this second clip, the letter to Mother, about a new resident of Nevada who writes home, and let's take off from there.
Dear Mother, our city lies in the midst of a desert of the purest, most unadulterated and uncompromising sand, in which infernal soil nothing but the fag end of vegetable creation, sagebrush, is mean enough to grow. Nevada territory is fabulously rich in gold, silver, lead, coal, iron, quicksilver, thieves, murderers, desperados, lawyers, Christians, Indians, Chinamen, Spaniards, gamblers, sharpers, coyotes, poets, preachers, and jackass rabbits.
So are people still going out there and joined by coyotes, thieves, murderers, robbers, and everything else that he described?
Yeah, I think that's a fairly good description of some parts of it. I was just thinking as I was watching that, it's nice to be introduced as the writer of these things. That, however, was Mark Twain. And
Well,
when you
you're in
can
good
work with
company.
him,
You're in
it's,
good company.
It's a pleasure to work with this large team that we gather for these
Well,
shows.
talking about teams, how did you all get together on this project?
Well, I had the idea, the impossible desire to make a film on the history of the West after the Civil War, but I was already committed to baseball. And I enlisted Jeff, and we needed to find someone who was capable of doing the day-to-day, the producing and directing. And that was Steve, who I'd worked with on Civil War briefly and baseball briefly. And he and I produced a history of the Congress, and he made a good film on Lindbergh, which Jeff wrote. So we've been sort of tied to each other intricately for about a dozen years, and the West is the latest fruit of that collaboration.
You know, if we're talking 5 years, but what kind of sort of day-to-day scheduling did you have? What kind of preparation did you do in terms of setting all of this up? I mean, what was the biggest surprise that you came upon sort of in all of this research? What sort of did you not expect that you would be putting into this?
Well, it wasn't so much
film?
one thing, but it was just I think the thing that was sobering, and I think this is true, must have been true for a great many pioneers who went west, was the sheer daunting quality of the Western landscape. We're driving around in a Chevy Suburban with, you know, all the modern conveniences, air conditioning. Granted, we're shooting sunrise and sunset in northern Montana in June, and it's a long day, but it just gave you a keen appreciation for what people really must have felt like and suffered through as they took their last emaciated ox and tried to make it across a place like the Black Rock Desert on their way to California. It makes you appreciate what the Donner Party must have gone through. And I think it's more a question of just trying to spread out and explore as many corners of the West as we could and talk to as many people as we could. And Jeff and Dayton, our writers, would come up with leads and stories that we thought were promising, and then you'd follow them, and sometimes you'd end up in a box canyon, you know, and you'd just have nowhere to go visually, or you'd get skunked and your helicopter shoot would be canceled. But other times, you know, you just come around a corner and meet some amazing person, and they'd lead you to a story of their ancestors that you couldn't have gotten out of central casting.
What was it that did give them the endurance and the strength to make these extraordinary journeys
That's the
across?
great
This is,
question.
this
Yeah.
is,
What was
this
it?
is the question I don't think you'll ever answer, but it seems to be about possibilities. There's something absolutely magnetic about the West, in the best sense of the word. In Steve's description, 100 yards from Jamestown, what is around that next bend? What are we going to find? Is it going to be better than it is now? And we follow this family that I mentioned a second ago called the Sagers, who begin in Virginia and go to Indiana and then go to Illinois and then go to Missouri and then are still restless. And they need to go to Oregon. And I don't know. It's a fantastic thing.
Well, what is the modern day version of the West? If it is, in a sense, a personification or an expression or a symbol of hope and opportunity, the ability to sort of remake your life. I mean, in a sense, if your first chance was sort of coming to the East Coast of the United States, everybody had a second chance by being able to go west. But the West, on one level, in a sense, is filled in now. That same kind of adventure where you could end up with your own homestead or what have you, that, in a sense, that's gone. What is the modern day version
Well, it's
of
funny,
this
I'm
sort
not-
of ladder of opportunity?
I'm not sure if it's really gone. I think it's recapitulating itself over again. We're struggling to figure out how you end this. You know, do you go up? And we began to find many of the same old questions rearing themselves up, the questions of the conquest of culture, of immigration, of land use, of resources. You know, you do a gold rush, and then suddenly 70 years later, you've got Spindletop and oil's discovered. And you realize that the West is going to continue to recycle through these problems. Now we're struggling with questions of immigration. Still the question of Native Americans and what their role is in all of this is as present now as it was before. It's just not on the front page. So I think in some ways we tried to watch one cycle of the questions of the West. And most of it, for everyone, despite the daunting landscape, was an interior question. That the West provided, it's those big spaces between that mountain and me that make me ask questions about myself. Who am I? What am I doing here? What is my place in this universe? And it's that interior question, that interior frontier, which is always there. And the West prompted that in Americans. And I think that's the mystery that we'll never, in 100 documentary films, be able to explain, but we'll, like that mountain range over there, be looking for.
Is it also sort of a trek that symbolizes individualism and entrepreneurial efforts on the part of small groups? I mean, what is the balance here between the individual and the community?
Well, that's another great question. And again, the myth of the West is that it's settled by intrepid, lonely pioneers. In fact, it was also settled with lots of government help. And I mean, all of these things are. That's what I love about doing these big stories. Is you just see how richly complicated it is, and how things were never simple.
Right, I just think gun control was something that you think that the rugged individualism that the West now promotes and celebrates and advertises as itself. Almost every cow town had a gun control law. You checked your gun at the door.
Yeah, that's
Which
how
was
they
like
tamed
hardly shockingly, if you were the marshal and 30 or 40 young guys who'd been looking at the wrong end of a cow for 2 or 3 months suddenly came into your town and got drunk, you wouldn't want them wearing guns. I mean, it's all the most natural kind of human reaction, and it's penetrating through that myth that we've sort of been saturated with, which makes it kind of an interesting detective story.
You know, the European communities, when they have farming communities, all their houses are in a village, and then they walk out or move out to their land area where they were farming. Whereas in America, the individual farmhouses were on the individual property, and in a sense you had a tremendous sense of isolation.
Right.
Particularly, it had an enormously serious impact on the women who had to work in these situations. How did that happen, rather than following the European model, for example?
Well, I think first of all, there was simply so much space. I mean, the space of the Great Plains overwhelmed European people who came out to settle there. They couldn't believe it. They planted trees not to necessarily hide from, but they were to protect them from the immensity of the landscape. And I think you'd find pioneer women who would have dead stuffed canaries in their trunks. And they kept these birds around because the smell, the sound of the canary was so sweet, it kept them. Sometimes they'd go, 20 miles just to watch a train go by, just to see more people. I mean, that's the kind of experience. It dwarfed anything that they could have known or imagined in Europe before they arrived. And I think that's why it created such a powerful, resonating kind of mythology about it. I mean,
Well, as you know, we could spend an awful lot of time talking about this. I think the best thing, the best alternative to this is actually watching it. But let me ask you one more question, since I know you work in 5-year intervals, Ken. What's your next 5-year project? I mean, I want to save my time 5 years from now.
And store up your
And- right,
videotape.
of course, yeah.
Well, we have 2 tracks. Jeff and I are working on a 5-year project on the history of jazz. Which
5
will-
shows are written. I just give you a little progress report.
And,
Out of how many?
Out of 8.
8. And we have 5 biographies, the first of which is Thomas Jefferson, coming in 6 months, followed by Lewis Clark, and then Frank Lloyd Wright, and then on and on. There's never a shortage of subjects.
Well, I have to say, I think that no other part of the world does documentaries, particularly historical documentaries, the way America does, and you all are the best there are. So I congratulate you, and I look forward very much to seeing all the rest of that. Thanks all very much for coming by. It's very wonderful to have you all.
Thanks,
thank you.
Mark.
Thank you.
Good.